Welcome to this journey through one of the most suppressed institutional horrors in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that lay buried in bureaucratic files for decades, where hundreds of forgotten souls defied all human dignity and left a legacy so disturbing that an entire state apparatus worked to erase their names from memory. It was the year 1952. The Korean War was consuming young American lives overseas, while at home, McCarthyism created an atmosphere of paranoia and conformity. Senator Joseph McCarthy was hunting communists. Dwight Eisenhower was campaigning for the presidency. America projected an image of post-war prosperity and suburban contentment. But in the rolling hills of southwestern Virginia, far from the sanitized images of American life appearing in magazines and television, something entirely different was happening. Something that would expose the darkest corners of institutional America. There, in Marion, Virginia, a small town cradled between the Blue Ridge and Appalachian Mountains, stood an imposing Gothic structure that locals referred to simply as the Asylum. Its official name was Western State Hospital, but those who lived in its shadow rarely spoke of it at all. When they did, their voices dropped to whispers. The building rose from the landscape like a monument to a darker age. Its brick facade, weathered by decades of Virginia's humid summers and bitter winters, stretched across 17 acres of manicured lawns that seemed designed to obscure what happened within. Tall windows, many barred, reflected the changing seasons. Oak trees, ancient and stoic, lined the paths leading to the main entrance, their branches reaching toward windows that held secrets no tree should witness. From certain angles, particularly at dusk when shadows stretched long across the grounds, Western State Hospital looked almost beautiful, almost serene. The architecture belonged to an era that believed imposing structures could somehow contain and correct the afflictions of the mind. Gothic revival towers, ornate cornices, stone steps worn smooth by countless feet. But beauty, as we'll discover, can be the most dangerous disguise of all. To understand what happened at Western State Hospital in 1952, we must first understand the world that created it, and the world that allowed it to exist unchallenged for so long. Virginia, in the early 1950s, was a state caught between competing identities. The Old South clung to traditions and hierarchies that the Civil War had supposedly ended nearly a century earlier. Segregation wasn't just law. It was the foundation of social order. The state's eugenics program, though waning after the horrors of Nazi Germany became fully known, had only officially ended a few years prior, leaving behind a legacy of forced sterilizations and pseudo-scientific racism that still influenced how institutions operated. Mental health treatment in America during this period existed in a strange twilight zone between medieval barbarism and modern medicine. The first antipsychotic medication, chlorpromazine, wouldn't be introduced until later in 1952. Insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive treatment without anesthesia, hydrotherapy that bordered on torture, and lobotomies were still considered standard treatments. The prevailing belief was that mental illness required forceful intervention, that the mind could be shocked, frozen, cut, or exhausted into normalcy. Western State Hospital had been accepting patients since 1825. Originally known as the Western Lunatic Asylum, it was Virginia's first facility dedicated exclusively to mental health treatment. By 1952, it housed over 2,000 patients, more than double its intended capacity. The overcrowding wasn't unique to Western State. Across America, Asylums swelled with populations that included not just the genuinely mentally ill, but also the inconvenient, unmarried pregnant women, political dissidents, epileptics, the elderly, with dementia, alcoholics, those who simply didn't conform to social expectations. The hospital's location in Marion was both blessing and curse. The Blue Ridge Mountains provided a stunning backdrop, and the theory held that the clean mountain air and beautiful vistas would aid in recovery. But the isolation also meant that what happened within those walls remained largely invisible to the outside world. Marion's population in 1952 was barely 6,000 people. Most worked in the hospital, at the nearby prison, or in the declining furniture factories that had once sustained the town's economy. The townspeople maintained an uneasy relationship with Western State. The hospital was the largest employer in the region, providing jobs in an area where work was scarce. Families who'd worked there for generations saw it as stable employment, a paycheck that arrived regularly even when the furniture factories closed. But it was also a place they didn't discuss at dinner tables, a place where you didn't ask too many questions about what your spouse or parent did during their shift. Children growing up in Marion learned early not to wander too close to the asylum's perimeter. The chain link fences, added in the 1940s, weren't just to keep patients in, they were to keep curious eyes out. Local legends circulated in hushed tones at sleepovers and around campfires, stories of screams that carried across the valley on windless nights, tales of patients who'd escaped and were never found, whispers about experimental treatments that went wrong. Most of these stories were dismissed as exaggerations, small town gossip, the kind of dark mythology that grows around any institution dealing with mental illness and death. But in 1952, some of those whispers began to solidify into something more tangible. It started with the smell. During the particularly hot summer of that year, residents in the neighborhoods closest to Western State began noticing an odor, sweet, sickly, unmistakable. It intensified during the afternoons when the sun beat down on the hospital's brick walls and paper roofs. Some described it as rotting vegetables. Others recognized it more accurately as the scent of decay. When complaints reached the town council, hospital administrators offered explanations. The incinerator was malfunctioning. The sewage system needed repairs. The kitchens were burning refuse. Each explanation was plausible enough to quiet immediate concerns. But the smell persisted, and with it came other disturbing signs. Dr. Emma Catherine Morrison arrived at Western State Hospital in January 1952, transferred from a smaller facility in Richmond. At 38 years old, she was one of the few female physicians in Virginia's mental health system, a rarity that made her simultaneously valuable and suspect in the male-dominated medical establishment. Morrison was small in stature, but possessed an intensity that commanded respect. She wore her dark hair pulled back severely, her white coats immaculately pressed, her manner professional to the point of coldness. This wasn't unfriendliness, it was armor. She'd learned early in her career that any hint of feminine warmth was interpreted as weakness, any emotional response as proof that women were too delicate for the difficult work of psychiatry. She'd requested the transfer to Western State specifically. In Richmond, she'd heard fragments of conversations between administrators, veiled references in medical journals, uncomfortable silences when Western State was mentioned at professional conferences. The official explanation for the transfer was that Western State needed additional psychiatric staff to handle the overwhelming patient population. The unofficial reality was that Morrison had been asking too many uncomfortable questions in Richmond about patient outcomes and mortality rates. Her supervisors had decided that Marion was remote enough to contain her curiosity. They were wrong. Morrison's first tour of the facility revealed conditions that shocked even her, seasoned as she was to the realities of institutional mental health care. The overcrowding was worse than statistics suggested. Wards designed for 40 patients housed 80 or more. Patients slept in hallways, in converted storage rooms, 3 to a bed in some cases. The noise was constant and overwhelming, a cacophony of weeping, shouting, laughter, and screams that echoed through corridors painted in institutional green and beige. The staff-to-patient ratio was catastrophically inadequate. On the night shift, a single attendant might be responsible for monitoring over 100 patients across multiple wards. Most attendants had no medical training whatsoever. Many were hired simply because they were strong enough to physically restrain violent patients. But it was the basement wards that truly disturbed Morrison. Western State Hospital had 3 levels below ground, officially used for storage, laundry facilities, and the morgue. But Morrison discovered that the lowest level had been converted into additional patient housing to accommodate the overflow. These subterranean wards had no windows. The lighting was inadequate, provided by bare bulbs that cast more shadows than illumination. The dampness seeped from limestone walls that had never been properly waterproofed. The air was stale, thick, difficult to breathe. The patients housed in these basement wards were categorized as difficult: those with violent tendencies, those who'd failed to respond to treatment, those deemed too disruptive for the main population. In practice, this meant that the basement had become a dumping ground for anyone the staff found inconvenient. Morrison found elderly patients with advanced dementia who posed no danger to anyone. She found young women whose only crime had been bearing children outside marriage. She found black patients who'd been segregated below ground simply because of their race. The conditions resembled something from a Charles Dickens novel more than a mid-20th century medical facility. Patients wore thin hospital gowns even in winter, when the basement became bitterly cold despite Virginia's moderate climate. Food was brought down once daily, carried in large pots by attendants who seemed eager to complete their duties and leave as quickly as possible. Bathing facilities were communal and primitive, a single room with shower heads that produced erratic streams of either scalding or freezing water. Morrison began documenting everything in a personal journal, separate from official medical records. She photographed conditions when possible, using a small camera she'd purchased with her own money. She interviewed patients, recording their accounts of treatment and living conditions. She reviewed death certificates and burial records. What she found was staggering. The mortality rate at Western State Hospital was more than triple the national average for similar institutions. In 1951 alone, over 200 patients had died deaths attributed to everything from pneumonia to heart failure to complications of mental illness. A catch-all diagnosis that meant essentially nothing. But the pattern Morrison identified was more specific. A disproportionate number of deaths occurred in the basement wards. Patients who'd been physically healthy upon admission deteriorated rapidly once moved below ground. Death certificates listed causes like tuberculosis, sepsis, malnutrition conditions that shouldn't have been epidemic in a medical facility. She brought her concerns to Dr. Harold Whitmore, Western State's medical director. Whitmore was 62 years old, a Virginia native who'd spent his entire career in state institutions. He had a reputation for efficiency, for running a facility that stayed within budget, and caused minimal political problems for the state government. Their meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Dr. Morrison, Whitmore had said, his voice carrying the slow, measured cadence of Virginia aristocracy, "You're new here. You don't yet understand the realities of managing a facility like this. We're doing the best we can with limited resources. The patients in the lower wards are there because they require that level of containment. If you find the work here too challenging, I'm sure we could arrange another transfer." The threat was unmistakable, but Morrison didn't frighten easily. She'd fought too hard for her medical degree, endured too much discrimination and dismissal, to back down now. She began working longer hours, arriving before dawn and leaving after dark. She spent time in the basement wards, talking to patients who'd been forgotten by everyone else, listening to stories that administrative records never captured. It was during one of these late-night visits in March 1952 that she made a discovery that would change everything. The patient's name was Ruth Elizabeth Hensley. She was 26 years old. Her medical file listed her diagnosis as schizophrenia with violent tendencies. But Morrison's evaluation revealed something quite different. Ruth was mildly intellectually disabled, and epileptic conditions that in 1952 were often conflated with mental illness and insanity. Ruth had been admitted to Western State 3 years earlier after having a seizure in public. Her family, poor tobacco farmers from the mountains of southwestern Virginia, had been convinced by local authorities that institutionalization was necessary for her safety and the safety of others. They'd believed, or been led to believe, that she would receive treatment and care. Instead, Ruth had spent 3 years in the basement wards. She'd been subjected to repeated electroshock therapy without anesthesia. She'd been restrained in a jacket, a primitive straitjacket, for days at a time when staff deemed her agitated. She'd witnessed things that would have traumatized even someone without existing vulnerabilities. But Ruth possessed something that many of her fellow patients had lost: memory, and the ability to articulate what she'd witnessed. Morrison sat with Ruth in a quiet corner of the basement ward, quiet being relative in a place where silence was as rare as hope. Ruth spoke in a low, halting voice, often pausing to organize her thoughts or to glance nervously at the doors, as if afraid of being overheard. "They take them at night," Ruth whispered. "The sickest ones, the ones who can't walk anymore or who have stopped eating. The attendants come with the gurneys. We hear the wheels squeaking. They go down the hallway to the room at the end, the room we're not allowed near." Morrison felt her pulse quicken. "What room, Ruth?" "The one behind the red door. It has a different lock than the others. Only Dr. Whitmore and Mr. Shepherd have keys." Mr. Shepherd was the head attendant, a man Morrison had immediately disliked, a former prison guard whose approach to patient care seemed to involve primarily intimidation and force. "What happens in that room?" Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know exactly, but the patients who go in don't come out, not alive. We hear things sometimes, sounds, and the smell." She trailed off, shaking her head. Morrison kept her voice steady, clinical. "How many patients have you seen taken to that room?" "Dozens, maybe more. It's hard to keep track. Time feels different down here, but it happens regularly. Every few days, someone else disappears." After her conversation with Ruth, Morrison waited until the night shift change. The chaos that occurred between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. when one set of understaffed attendants departed and another arrived. She slipped away from the main corridors and made her way through the basement's labyrinthine passages. The hospital's oldest sections had been built in stages over a century, additions grafted onto original structures in ways that created strange dead ends and forgotten spaces. Morrison had studied the architectural plans stored in the administrative offices, but even those didn't fully capture the confusing geography of Western states' subterranean levels. She found the red door at the end of a corridor that saw little traffic. Unlike other doors in the basement, this one was solid metal, painted a dark red that looked almost black in the dim lighting. A heavy padlock secured it, no window, no signage indicating what lay beyond. Morrison stood there for several minutes, listening. From behind the door came a low mechanical hum, some kind of machinery or ventilation system, but no voices, no other sounds. She returned to the basement wards and spent the next 2 weeks establishing a pattern. She observed when the red door was accessed, noting the times and the staff members who appeared. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. Every 3 to 4 days, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the deadest hours of the night, when even the most vigilant attendants grew drowsy, Dr. Whitmore and Mr. Shepherd would arrive at the basement. They'd select a patient, typically someone in severely deteriorated condition, and wheel them on a gurney to the red door. The entire process took less than an hour. By dawn, the selected patient's bed would be empty. Administrative records would note their transfer to specialized care, or their death from natural causes. Burial would follow quickly, often within 24 hours, in the hospital's cemetery, a sprawling, largely unmarked tract of land on the property's eastern edge. Morrison knew she needed to see what was behind that door, but the padlock was formidable, and she had neither the skills to pick it nor the authority to demand access. The solution came from an unexpected source. Joseph "Joe" Williams was a maintenance worker at Western State, an older black man who'd worked at the hospital for nearly 30 years. Joe was largely invisible to the medical staff, part of that permanent underclass of workers who kept institutions functioning while remaining perpetually overlooked. He mopped floors, repaired plumbing, fixed electrical problems, and maintained the boilers that heated the sprawling complex. Joe also had a complete set of master keys that opened almost every door in the facility, and he had his own suspicions about what was happening in the basement. Morrison approached him carefully one afternoon in late April, finding him in the boiler room where he worked largely alone. She'd always treated Joe with respect, a rarity in an era and institution where racial hierarchies were rigid and unquestioned, and he'd noticed. "Dr. Morrison," he said when she appeared, his weathered face showing surprise, "something wrong with the heating in your office." "No, Joe, I need your help with something else, something important." She told him what she'd observed. The disappearances, the red door, the impossible mortality rates. Joe listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly grave. When she finished, Joe was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I wondered when someone would finally notice. I've been working here since 1923. Used to be different. Not good, mind you. These places are never good but different. When Dr. Whitmore took over in 1947, things changed. He brought in Shepherd, started making changes to the basement, built that room himself, hired outside contractors so regular maintenance wouldn't know what was going in there. You know what's in that room. I've got suspicions. I've seen equipment being delivered late at night, seen the smoke from the incinerator running at odd hours, seen burial records that don't make sense, bodies listed at weights that seem wrong, too light." He paused. "My daughter worked here for a while as a nurse's aide. She quit after 6 months. Wouldn't tell me why exactly, but she had nightmares for a year after. Kept saying she'd seen things that weren't right, things that couldn't be real. Will you help me?" Joe studied her for a long moment. He was risking everything. His job, possibly worse. A black man in 1950s Virginia who accused white doctors of wrongdoing would face consequences far beyond unemployment. But Joe Williams had seen too much to remain silent any longer. "I'll get you in there," he said, "but we've got to be smart about it, and you've got to be prepared for what you might find." They waited until May 12, 1952, a Sunday night when staffing was at its thinnest, and Dr. Whitmore was scheduled to be off the grounds attending a psychiatric conference in Richmond. Joe had provided Morrison with careful instructions. She was to enter through the maintenance access tunnel that connected the main building to the boiler room, a passage that staff rarely used and that security patrols didn't monitor. At exactly 2:30 a.m., when the night attendants would be gathered in the break room for their shift meal, Joe would meet her at the entrance to the restricted corridor. Morrison barely slept that Saturday night. She lay in her small apartment in Marion, a second-floor walk-up that overlooked Main Street, and stared at the ceiling, playing through scenarios of what she might find. Part of her hoped she was wrong, that her suspicions were simply the result of an overactive imagination combined with the genuine but explainable problems of an overcrowded, underfunded institution. But she knew better. She'd seen too much, documented too many inconsistencies. The truth was behind that red door, and it would be worse than anything she'd imagined. Sunday arrived with a warm spring rain that turned to drizzle by evening. Morrison went through her normal routine, attending church services at Marion Methodist. Maintaining appearances was crucial, then spending the afternoon reviewing patient files in her office. She left the hospital at 6 p.m. as usual, went home, ate a dinner she barely tasted, and waited. At 2 a.m., dressed in dark clothes with a flashlight tucked in her coat pocket, she made her way through Marion's empty streets. The town was utterly silent except for the rain, which had resumed with soft persistence. No cars passed. No windows showed light. It was as if the entire world had gone to sleep, leaving only her and whatever secrets awaited. The maintenance tunnel was exactly where Joe had described behind the hospital's eastern wing, concealed by overgrown rhododendrons that had been allowed to grow wild. The entrance was a simple metal door set into a concrete wall, marked only with peeling paint that might once have read "Authorized Personnel Only." Morrison descended into darkness. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and heating oil. Her flashlight beam bounced off sweating concrete walls and exposed pipes. Water dripped from somewhere above. Her footsteps echoed despite her efforts at silence. Joe was waiting where he'd promised, a shadow that materialized so suddenly Morrison nearly cried out. He pressed a finger to his lips, then gestured for her to follow. They moved through the basement's maze, like passages, avoiding the main corridors where even at this hour attendants might be making rounds. Joe navigated with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the building's bones. Finally, they reached the familiar corridor. The red door stood before them, as ominous as Morrison remembered. Joe produced a key from his pocket. His hand, Morrison noticed, trembled slightly as he inserted it into the padlock. The mechanism clicked open with a sound that seemed explosively loud in the silence. "Whatever we find in there," Joe whispered, "we document it. We remember every detail, because they'll try to deny it, and we'll need to be certain of what we saw." Morrison nodded, her mouth too dry for speech. Joe pulled open the door. The hinges screamed in protest. And then they stepped into the room beyond. The smell hit them first, a concentrated version of the odor that had troubled Marion's residents all summer. Sweet, chemical, nauseating. Morrison instinctively covered her nose and mouth. The room was larger than she'd expected, roughly 30 feet square with a high ceiling. The walls were lined with white tile, the kind used in morgues and operating rooms. surfaces that could be easily cleaned of biological material. Industrial lights hung from the ceiling, currently dark, but Morrison's flashlight revealed enough. Against the far wall stood what looked like a massive industrial oven. An incinerator, Morrison realized, but far larger than the one used for the hospital's regular medical waste. Beside it sat metal gurneys, straps dangling from their sides. A table held instruments, scalpels, saws, clamps, arranged with disturbing precision. But it was what covered the work table in the room's center that caused Morrison's flashlight to slip from suddenly nerveless fingers. Bodies, or parts of bodies, human remains in various states of dissection, organs preserved in jars, bones cleaned of flesh, arranged as if for study, medical diagrams pinned to walls, showing anatomical illustrations alongside handwritten notes. Joe made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Morrison forced herself to pick up her flashlight, to examine what lay before them, to be the doctor rather than the horrified human. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a morgue. It was an experimentation chamber. Someone had been conducting research on human subjects. Post-mortem research at minimum, and possibly worse. Morrison moved closer to the work table, fighting waves of nausea. The jars were labeled with dates, patient identification numbers, and clinical observations. She recognized some of the numbers from burial records she'd reviewed. Patients officially buried in Western States Cemetery. Patients whose graves, if exhumed, would likely be found empty or contain only partial remains. The documentation was meticulous. Whoever had done this had kept detailed records. Morrison found filing cabinets against one wall, pulled open drawers, and discovered patient files that had been removed from official records. Progress notes documenting experimental treatments, photographs showing surgical procedures, data tables tracking the effects of various drugs and interventions. Some of the treatments described in these secret files made Morrison's blood run cold. Experimental lobotomies performed without proper anesthetic. Injections of substances Morrison didn't recognize. Vivisection. The word appeared repeatedly in the notes. Vivisection. The dissection of living subjects. Dear God, Joe whispered from across the room. He was standing before a wall covered in photographs, images of patients, before and after various procedures. The suffering captured in those images was indescribable. Morrison knew they had to leave, had to get this evidence to authorities immediately. But she also knew they needed documentation of their own. Using a camera Joe had brought, she began systematically photographing everything. The room lay out, the equipment, the remains, the files. She worked with clinical efficiency, disconnecting her emotions, focusing on the mechanical task of creating an irrefutable record. They were so focused on documentation that they almost didn't hear the footsteps in the corridor outside. Almost, Joe grabbed Morrison's arm, extinguished her flashlight. They froze in absolute darkness. The footsteps grew closer. Multiple people, voices, one of them unmistakably Dr. Whitmore. The conference ended early. Whitmore was saying, "Board voted more quickly than anticipated. I wanted to check on the latest specimens before." He fell silent as he reached the door and found it unlocked, standing slightly ajar. "Shepard," Whitmore said, his voice suddenly sharp, "the door is open." "That's impossible, sir. I locked it myself after." "Check inside, now." Morrison and Joe pressed themselves against the wall, hidden in shadows. But there was nowhere to run, no escape route. Shepard entered first, reaching for a light switch. Morrison made a decision. Before the lights could come on, before they could be discovered cowering in the dark, she stepped forward into the doorway, her flashlight beam aimed directly into Shepard's face. "Looking for someone, Mr. Shepherd." The confrontation that followed would later be described in newspapers, official reports, and courtroom testimony. But the truth of that moment, the raw, terrified, explosive truth, was something documentation could never fully capture. Shepherd reacted with pure rage, lunging at Morrison with an incoherence born of panic. He was a large man, over 6 feet tall and heavily built, his years as a prison guard having honed an instinct for physical dominance. But Joe Williams stepped between them, showing the kind of courage that transcended self-preservation. "You're not touching her," Joe said, his voice steady despite the fear Morrison could see in his eyes. Dr. Whitmore remained in the corridor, his face bloodless in the weak light. For a moment, nobody moved. The tableau held accusers, and accused frozen in mutual recognition that everything was about to change irrevocably. Then Whitmore spoke, and his words revealed the depth of his miscalculation. "Dr. Morrison, I understand how this might appear to someone unfamiliar with advanced psychiatric research, but I assure you, everything you've seen here is sanctioned by whom?" Morrison's voice cut through his attempted rationalization like a scalpel. "Show me the authorization for human experimentation. Show me the consent forms. Show me the ethical review that approved vivisection." The silence that followed was damning. Morrison pressed on. "I've documented everything in this room. I have photographs. I have copies of your files. And I have witnessed testimony from patients who have seen people disappear into this chamber of horrors you've created. You have nothing that will be believed," Whitmore said, his composure beginning to crack. "Do you understand who I am, the position I hold? I've treated governors, senators. My research is on the cutting edge of psychiatric medicine. And you, a woman who's been at this facility for then 6 months, known for making trouble, for questioning her superiors, who do you think anyone will believe?" It was a threat that might have worked in another era, another circumstance. But Whitmore had made a fundamental error. He'd forgotten that Morrison hadn't come alone. And Joe Williams, standing there as a witness, represented something Whitmore hadn't anticipated. A working, class man of principle who had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. "They'll believe the photographs," Morrison said. "They'll believe the physical evidence, and they'll believe the other doctors and nurses at this facility who have suspected something was wrong but were too frightened to speak up. Your reign ends tonight, Dr. Whitmore." Shepherd made another move toward them, but Joe produced a length of pipe from his work belt, a tool that suddenly became a weapon. "I've worked at this hospital for 3 decades, Joe said. "I've kept my head down, done my job, stayed invisible because that's what men like me have to do to survive. But I draw the line at murder, and that's what this is. Murder dressed up in medical terminology." Morrison backed toward the door, keeping her flashlight trained on both men. "We're leaving now. We're going directly to the sheriff's office. If you're wise, you'll both remain here and surrender peacefully when the authorities arrive." They didn't. As Morrison and Joe fled through the basement corridors, they heard Shepherd behind them, shouting for other attendants. The hospital erupted into chaos. Alarms began ringing, a sound typically reserved for patient escapes, now repurposed to signal something far more threatening to the institution's established order. Morrison and Joe ran through the maintenance tunnel, emerging into a dawn that was just beginning to break over Marion. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. They sprinted the 3 blocks to the Smythe County Sheriff's Office, a brick building that shared space with the town's volunteer fire department. Sheriff Thomas Ridgway had been sheriff for 12 years, a position he'd won through local popularity rather than any particular law enforcement expertise. He was a good man by most measures, honest, friendly, devoted to his church and community. But he was also deeply invested in Marion's status quo, and Western State Hospital was Marion's economic lifeblood. When Morrison and Joe burst through his door at 5:47 a.m., disheveled and frantic, demanding an immediate investigation of multiple murders at the hospital, Ridgway's first instinct was skepticism. Bordering on dismissal, "Now, Dr. Morrison," he began, using the patronizing tone men in the 1950 reserved for women they considered hysterical, "I'm sure whatever you think you saw." Morrison slammed her camera onto his desk. "I have photographic evidence of human remains, unauthorized medical experimentation, and systematic murder. Are you going to act on this information, Sheriff, or do I need to drive to Richmond and present it to the state police?" The threat of going over his head, of making this a scandal that reached beyond Marion, changed Ridgway's demeanor immediately. He studied Morrison's face, saw the absolute conviction there, and made a decision that would define the rest of his career. "All right," he said, "show me what you have." The raid on Western State Hospital began at 8:30 a.m. that morning. Sheriff Ridgway, accompanied by every deputy he could muster, a total of 5 men along with Morrison, Joe, and a local photographer named Harold Kemp, who happened to be in the station, descended on the hospital with a search warrant Ridgway had hastily convinced a judge to sign. Dr. Whitmore met them at the entrance, flanked by the hospital's attorney, a man who'd been summoned in the intervening hours. Whitmore had regained his composure, dressed now in an immaculate suit, every inch the distinguished physician. "This is highly irregular," Whitmore said. "This hospital operates under state authority. You have no jurisdiction here, Sheriff. This warrant says otherwise." Ridgway replied, his country, lawyer accent suddenly replaced by something harder, more official. "I have probable cause to believe serious crimes have been committed on these premises. You can cooperate, or you can be arrested for obstruction." They accessed the Red Room. Despite Whitmore's protests, despite the attorney's threats of lawsuits and career-ending repercussions, they photographed everything Morrison had seen, plus more that had been missed in the dark. They collected physical evidence. They interviewed patients in the basement wards, taking sworn statements. The subsequent investigation would last 7 months. The trial of Dr. Harold Whitmore and Mr. Raymond Shepard began on January 14, 1953, in the Smythe County Courthouse. The case had attracted national attention. Journalists from major newspapers packed the courthouse, their presence transforming Marion from a sleepy mountain town into the temporary center of America's consciousness. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. 147 patients had died under suspicious circumstances between 1948 and 1952. Of those, at least 63 had been subjected to unauthorized medical experimentation. Remains of 41 individuals were identified through various means: dental records, distinguishing features, personal effects. The testimony was difficult even for seasoned court observers to hear. Ruth Hensley, the patient who'd first spoken to Dr. Morrison, took the stand and described years of witnessing patients disappear into the Red Room. Other patients testified to being subjected to procedures without consent, to seeing fellow patients die from experimental treatments, to being threatened with punishment if they spoke about what they'd witnessed. Dr. Morrison's testimony spanned 3 full days. She walked the jury through her investigation, presented her photographic evidence, explained in clinical detail the horror she'd uncovered. She was cross-examined relentlessly by the defense, which attempted to portray her as an ambitious woman with a vendetta against male authority, as someone prone to emotional exaggeration, as a troublemaker who'd been fired from previous positions. But Morrison held firm. When the defense attorney suggested she'd fabricated evidence, she calmly replied, "I am a physician. My oath is to do no harm. I have violated that oath by remaining silent as long as I did. I will not compound my failure by allowing these crimes to be minimized or excused." Joe Williams testified about his 3 decades at the hospital, about the changes he'd witnessed under Whitmore's leadership, about his own daughter's traumatic experience working there. His testimony carried particular weight. Here was a man with everything to lose and nothing to gain by lying, whose quiet dignity contrasted sharply with the defense's attempts to discredit him. The defense strategy centered on portraying Whitmore as a dedicated researcher, pushing the boundaries of psychiatric medicine for the greater good. Expert witnesses testified about the importance of advancing medical knowledge, about the difficult ethical questions surrounding treatment of the severely mentally ill, about the reality that some patients were beyond help and might as well contribute to science. It was a defense that might have worked in earlier eras. But 1953 was different. The Nuremberg trials had concluded less than a decade earlier. The world had learned what happened when medical ethics were abandoned in the name of scientific progress. The defense's arguments echoed too closely the justifications offered by Nazi doctors. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by Commonwealth's attorney Robert Hayes, would be remembered as one of the most powerful in Virginia legal history. "Gentlemen of the jury," Hayes said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "the defense would have you believe this is a complicated matter of medical ethics, of balancing individual suffering against collective advancement, but I submit to you that this case is actually quite simple. Dr. Whitmore and Mr. Shepard took human beings, vulnerable people entrusted to their care, and treated them as objects, as specimens, as disposable resources to be used and discarded. They did this in secret because they knew it was wrong. They destroyed records because they knew it was criminal. They threatened witnesses because they knew it was indefensible. These weren't mercy killings. These weren't unavoidable deaths of severely ill patients. These were murders, systematic, calculated, documented murders, and the victims were chosen specifically because the defendants believed no one would care, no one would notice, no one would seek justice for the forgotten souls locked away in Western State Hospital. They were almost right, but they underestimated the courage of Dr. Morrison, who risked her career to expose the truth. They underestimated Joe Williams, who risked everything to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. And they underestimated you, 12 citizens of Virginia, who have the power to declare that every life has value, that no one is so forgotten that their murder can be excused, that we are a society of laws and ethics and fundamental human dignity. Find these men guilty. Send a message that will echo beyond this courtroom, beyond Marion, beyond Virginia. Send a message that we have learned from history's darkest chapters, that never again means never again. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Dr. Harold Whitmore was sentenced to life imprisonment. Raymond Shepard received 25 years. Both men maintained their innocence, insisting to the end that they'd been conducting legitimate research, that the ungrateful masses simply couldn't understand the sacrifices necessary for medical progress. Whitmore died in 1961 at the Virginia State Penitentiary, 8 years into his sentence. The official cause was heart failure. Shepard was released in 1972 after serving 19 years. He lived until 1989, working in maintenance at various facilities, never speaking publicly about his time at Western State. But the story didn't end with their convictions. The trial sparked a national reckoning with conditions in mental institutions across America. Journalists investigating their own state's facilities discovered that Western State wasn't an isolated horror, but part of a broader systemic failure. Overcrowding, abuse, neglect, and yes, in some cases unauthorized experimentation existed from coast to coast. Within 5 years of the trial, Congress would pass the Mental Health Study Act, beginning a process of reform that would eventually lead to the deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 70s. The reforms had their own problems. Closing institutions without adequate community support created new crises, but at least the conversation had shifted. The invisible were becoming visible. Western State Hospital itself underwent complete restructuring. The entire administrative staff was replaced. The basement wards were permanently closed and eventually filled with concrete. New oversight mechanisms were implemented. Patient advocacy groups were formed. Families were given greater access to their institutionalized relatives. Dr. Catherine Morrison became something of an unwilling celebrity. She was invited to testify before congressional committees, to speak at medical conferences, to advise on institutional reform. But the attention exhausted her. She'd wanted to be a doctor, not a crusader. In 1955, she left Virginia and opened a small private practice in rural Vermont, where she treated patients quietly and effectively until her retirement in 1984. She rarely spoke about Western State. When she did, her words were measured, almost clinical. "I did what any physician should do," she said in one of her few interviews. "I observed, I documented, I reported. The courage wasn't mine. It belonged to patients like Ruth Hensley, who survived long enough to tell their stories, and to people like Joe Williams, who risked everything to help me expose the truth." Joe Williams returned to work at Western State after the trial. The hospital was still Marion's largest employer, and he still needed the paycheck. But he was treated differently now, no longer invisible. The new administration consulted him on facilities improvements, on patient welfare, on creating systems that might prevent future abuses. He worked there until his retirement in 1968, dying peacefully in 1975 at age 73. Ruth Hensley was released from Western State in 1954, part of a review process that reevaluated every patient's diagnosis and commitment. She returned to her family's farm in the mountains, living there until her death in 2003 at age 77. She never fully recovered from her years in the institution, but she lived with dignity, surrounded by family who finally understood that her conditions had never warranted institutionalization in the first place. The victims, those 147 souls whose lives were cut short, whose suffering was compounded by the violation of being treated as experimental subjects, received a measure of recognition. In 1956, Virginia erected a memorial in Western States Cemetery. A simple granite stone that read, "In memory of those who suffered and died here, 1948-1952. May their stories never be forgotten." It's not enough. It can never be enough, but it's something. The Western State Hospital scandal of 1952 remains a disturbing reminder that institutional authority, medical credentials, and bureaucratic efficiency can become instruments of terrible harm when divorced from fundamental ethics and human compassion. It reminds us that the most vulnerable members of society, the mentally ill, the disabled, the poor, those society deems inconvenient or troublesome, have always been at greatest risk of abuse. That invisibility can be fatal. that institutions we trust to care for people can become engines of destruction when they operate without transparency or accountability. But the story also demonstrates something essential about human courage and moral clarity. Dr. Morrison and Joe Williams had everything to lose by speaking up. They could have looked away, told themselves that what happened in the basement wasn't their responsibility, that one person couldn't change a system so entrenched and powerful. They chose differently. They chose to document the truth, to risk their safety and livelihoods, to trust that justice was possible even when it seemed unlikely. And their courage created ripples that extended far beyond Marion, Virginia, contributing to reforms that improved conditions for millions of institutionalized Americans in the decades that followed. But questions remain, questions that haunt anyone who examines this case closely. How many other hospitals conducted similar experiments in those years? The investigation into Western State was thorough, but it focused on one institution in one small town. What happened in facilities that didn't have a doctor? Morrison asking uncomfortable questions. What happened in states where oversight was even weaker, where the vulnerable were even more invisible? The fragmentary records that survived suggest that Western State wasn't unique. Investigations sparked by the scandal uncovered troubling practices at institutions across Virginia and beyond. But many records were destroyed before they could be examined. Many patients who might have testified had already died or were deemed unreliable witnesses due to their diagnoses. We'll never know the full scope, and that uncertainty is perhaps the most haunting aspect of all, knowing that the horror we uncovered might represent only a fraction of what occurred. To this day, Western State Hospital continues to operate, though under a different name and with radically different practices. The building from 1952 was demolished in the 1980s, replaced by modern facilities designed with transparency and patient dignity as core principles. Staff receive extensive training in ethics and patient rights. Oversight is constant. Families are involved in treatment decisions. But the old hospital's cemetery remains. If you visit Marion, Virginia, and drive to the eastern edge of what was once Western State's property, you'll find it. Acre after acre of graves, many unmarked, containing the remains of thousands of patients who died there over 127 years of operation. On quiet mornings, when fog rolls down from the Blue Ridge Mountains and settles over the valley, the cemetery takes on an ethereal quality. The granite memorial stone stands among the graves, weathered now but still legible. Visitors occasionally leave flowers there, though no one knows exactly who they're honoring. The records are too incomplete, the dead too numerous and forgotten. Local residents report that sometimes, on those foggy mornings, they hear sounds from the cemetery. Whispers, weeping, the creak of gurney wheels. Most dismiss this as wind in the trees, the acoustics of the valley playing tricks. The rational explanation, but some who have heard those sounds, particularly those old enough to remember 1952, to remember when the story broke and shocked the nation, aren't so sure. They wonder if perhaps the dead at Western State Hospital are still telling their stories, still insisting on being remembered, still demanding that we never forget what happened when society decided that some lives were less valuable than others. The story of Western State Hospital in 1952 is a story about power and vulnerability, about the corruption of healing professions, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. It's about how evil can hide behind professional credentials and institutional authority, and it's about how truth, once exposed, can transform systems that seemed immovable. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own era. What institutions operate today with insufficient oversight? Who are the invisible people in our society, the ones whose suffering goes unwitnessed, whose deaths go unmourned, whose stories remain untold? What happens in places we'd rather not look at too closely? These questions don't have easy answers. They require vigilance, moral courage, and a commitment to believing that every human life has inherent dignity and value, not because it's easy or convenient, but because the alternative is too terrible to accept. If this journey through one of Virginia's darkest chapters has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the thin line between healing and harm, between authority and atrocity, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, truths hidden by those who preferred darkness to light. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on institutional accountability, on how we protect the vulnerable, on what safeguards are necessary to prevent history from repeating its cruelest chapters. The forgotten deserve to be remembered. The silenced deserve to have their stories told. And we, the living, have a responsibility to listen not just to the comfortable histories that make us feel good about our past, but to the difficult truths that challenge us to build a more just and compassionate future. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful institutions tried to bury.